About 200 million years ago, it's generally agreed, all of the land on planet Earth was together in one huge mass, a supercontinent called Pangaea. With the core of the Earth red-hot molten rock, this vast expanse of land, like a floating outer crust, gradually broke apart and formed the continents as we know them today.
So the origins of this landscape lie deep in geological time. We've got to go back beyond 145 million years ago to the start of a period called the Cretaceous, where there was no land around here at all. At that point in time, the area that was Britain was basically deep tropical water. In fact, it was a long way south, a lot nearer the equator. The kind of oceans we're thinking of are kind of things that you would get around the Bahamas today. And within this warm ocean, billions of microscopic creatures over millions of years thrived and died, and all of their tiny skeletal bodies floated down to the bottom of this ocean, forming a kind of muddy ooze at the bottom of the sea. And because their bodies were made up of calcium, all of that calcium eventually produced a rock. It kind of cemented itself in a chemical process that you'd get if you were making cement. And within it there were burrows of lobsters and other creatures that eventually filled with silica and formed flint, which is the other big rock that we have around here. And all of that's taking place deep under the ocean. This goes on for millions of years. There's lots of cycles of climate change, but generally the planet is very warm. The planet is in a greenhouse state with lots of carbon dioxide. And so these bodies of tiny creatures are building up into a rock deposit that's hundreds of meters thick. A massive asteroid collides with Earth in the Gulf of Mexico, wipes out not only all of the land creatures, which are the dinosaurs, which go extinct at 65 million years, but most of the characteristic life forms in the sea, huge spiral-shaped ammonites and tiny microscopic creatures went extinct at this point in time. We then have climate change across the planet. The planet begins to cool, and we get new life forms, we get mammals developing and spreading, but we also get other changes happening deep under the ocean, because what is now Africa begins to move into what is now Europe and starts to push up these rocks in a great big series of folds and ripples, beginning with the Atlas Mountains in North Africa and the Alps in southern Europe, rippling out through northern Europe, eventually pushing up the chalk here in southern Britain into a big series of folds that go over the Weald 60 miles to the north and then drop down under London. It's at that point in time that the dry land that we now know as Britain becomes risen from the sea. If you stand on Wolstonbury Hill, you're looking out to the north into the Weald, an area of low-lying landscape. But originally, these were a whole series of rocks that are lifted up by the folding of the Alps moving into Europe. And as soon as they begin to rise up out of the sea, they start to erode and they start to wash away. And that's why the Weald is an area of low-lying landscape. Because it's counterintuitive, the area of uplift, because it's lifting up, fractures more, and ends up being a void. So the South Downs are the southern remnants of what would have been a dome of rock if it hadn't been eroded away. The South Downs are a really characteristic landscape. You know, they're very easily recognisable with these beautiful bow-headed hill fronts and dry valleys cutting through. None of the processes that gave rise to the South Downs and those shapes we can see in the world today, because they're all formed during ice ages. Up until that point, the planet had been a lot warmer than it is today. It got cooler and cooler until after 1 million years ago, the planet started to set up into these really regular cycles of 100,000 years, 80,000 years of which it was much colder than it is today, with much more extended polar ice caps. One of the effects of having bigger ice sheets at the two poles is that water is sucked out of the planet system and sea level lowers. So during these cold ice ages, sea level can be as much as 150 meters lower than it is now. And the ice, at its maximum extent, once got as far as London, which is why the River Thames is bulldozed into the position it is now. It's during these cycles of profound change in terms of the arrangement of ice and water on the planet that the features that we see in the landscapes around us have been formed. Now, southern Britain was never glaciated. It was never under an ice sheet. That halted at London. But we're only a few tens of miles south of a wall of ice that's hundreds of meters thick. It would have been intensely cold here for tens of thousands of years on end. During periods of warming, either in the spring, during relatively warm periods, or coming out of ice ages, all the ice, the permafrost that's forming in the soil has to go somewhere. And where it wants to go is sometimes 150 meters lower than where we are now, the sea. And so there's a huge amount of energy locked up in that permafrost and in that ice, and that carves out the landscape we can see today. If we look to the south of Wolstonbury Hill, we can see the great dry valley that the London Road now goes to. If we went back to the end of the last ice age, that would have seasonally been a torrent of meltwater, washing away flint, washing away chalk. At the same time, permafrost is melting on the valley sides and you're getting mud flows bringing down flint and chalk into the valley bottoms. These would have been really dramatic processes. So when we see features like the London Road Dry Valley or something as stark as Devil's Dyke, what's formed them is melting ice under permafrost conditions. And that played out over hundreds of thousands of years, multiple ice age cycles, is what's given rise to the South Downs landforms that we can see today and their characteristic features. So the Ice Age is also the period in which we see humans first appear in Europe and then in Britain. Our genus Homo begins in Africa maybe as long ago as 3 million years. But it's not until 1.5 million years ago that humans first appear in Europe. And then by just after 1 million years ago, we start to find the first traces of humans in Britain. All the landscapes of the South Downs have been too eroded to ever hope to find anything as old as 1 million years. But by the time we get to 500,000 years ago, we start to find traces in the forms of flint tools, and if we're lucky, butchered animal bones, and sometimes the fossilized remains of these early humans themselves here in Sussex. And within 2 or 3 miles of Wolstonbury Hill, especially around Hassocks and around Poynings, these tools have been found. And we found the bones not only of cold-loving animals like woolly mammoth and woolly rhinoceros, and the horses and reindeer that would have been around during the cold periods, but in the warm periods there's also exotic animals like straight-tusked elephant, hippo, rhinoceros, lots of the kinds of animals that we'd find here today as well, your deer, your badgers and birds. But humans couldn't stay here all the time. We're going through these cycles of climate change, of global warming and global cooling, and during the coldest periods it's just too cold here in southern Britain. Southern Britain is too far north on the planet to support human populations. So what the archaeological record shows us is humans have come to Britain and flourished and then had to leave again on at least 10 separate cycles. We are the 10th attempt to stay and colonize Britain. So the last of these cold stages, the last ice age, had ended by 11,000 years ago. And this warm period that we're in now began just like any other warm period. Global temperatures started to rise, permafrost gave way to open grassland soils, and trees started to colonize through northern Europe First of all birch, then willow, some juniper, and then eventually behind them more warm loving trees like oak and elm and hazel. And within this changing landscape, going from cool open environments to warm forest environments, humans are adapting and changing. And so we find the archaeological record of Mesolithic people, the Middle Stone Age, and there's abundant evidence for them around here, not only from the sandy areas of Sussex and Hurstbeer Point, but also nearby on Clayton Hill. But the Mesolithic people aren't just adapting by just hunting, they're adapting by transforming the landscape. They're probably starting to make clearings, they're starting to use fire, and they're starting to use flint axes to bring down trees, open up areas which would create concentrations for game. They may also be managing the woodland to increase productivity of things like hazelnuts, which for some reason they collected in abundance. They had a very rich culture with a very rich cultural identity, religious practices that were, based on probably sympathetic magic to aid hunting and to connect with the ancestors, but also controlling environment and closely controlling the game to maximize productivity. And their way of life continues on in this landscape for thousands of years until there's a very sudden change. And this sudden change comes with the arrival of what we think are new people coming into this landscape around 6,000 years ago. They're bringing with them the knowledge of agriculture, growing crops and transforming animals through selective breeding into the domesticated forms that we see today. And they are transforming the landscape by mining, raising monuments to the dead in the first barrows, and creating the first enclosures. Large circular enclosures cut in chalk in the landscape. That's the first evidence of monumentality anywhere in Northern Europe. By the time we move into the Bronze Age, 4,000 years ago, we see an even greater impact on the landscape. At this point in time, we start to see a new burial tradition. Gone are the long and oval barrows of the Neolithic, which have far more collective burial, and we start to find the isolated round barrows, a variety of forms of them that we can see along the ridges of the downs. Quite often these round barrows will focus on the burial of a single individual. And this is something that we just don't see in the burial record before. In the landscape as well, we start to see a lot of soil erosion at the moment. If we were to dig into the bottom of the valleys, at the foot of Wolstonbury Hill, we would find the soils that are eroded off at this point in time through this intensification of agriculture. This reflects the development of an entirely new way of transforming and engineering the landscape, turning the South Downs into, in a way, the landscape we see now. Completely deforested, stripped of its fertile brown soils and intensively grazed. The South Downs is home to incredible chalk grassland communities that globally are very rare and very localized to here. But that's an entirely humanly created ecology and a humanly created landscape, one formed by intensification and erosion during the Bronze Age.
This looks like a barrow. And then you've got, can you see this? Because it doesn't make any sense putting a monument, on the slope.
Yeah.
But this is now on the spur. Yeah. And then there's a round barrow up there.
Over there. So am I standing on the sort of southern edge of it then?
Yeah. This looks like the centre of it. It's bronze. I'm sure that this is Bronze Age, and that's just a round barrow. Yeah, it's just a flat platform barrow. So we've got platform barrow there, round barrow there. It's cross ridge dike there. And isn't that's a cross-ridge dike there as well, isn't it?
Well, it looks like one actually.
Yeah.
I'd never noticed that before.
Yeah. You know, you can see a very definite northern edge to it. So I drop down here and then I can see I'm walking around it here. And then, yeah, round to there. Yeah. This mound behind me is one of the most conspicuous features in the landscape of a new type of funerary practice that begins in southern Britain around 4,000 years ago. Coming with the earliest arrival of bronze objects into the landscape, we start to also find round mounds that we call barrows, which are part of this funerary landscape. The mound itself would have originally been made out of chalk. What we can't see is underneath me here is a circular ditch that would have been excavated into the ground, and chalk from that ditch would have been piled into the middle of the circle, raising up a large conspicuous mound. And Wolstonbury Hill has at least two very good examples, this round barrow here, and a few hundred meters to the northwest, a platform barrow of similar size but not quite as high. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the barrows became the target for artifact hunting during the 18th and 19th century, and it doesn't seem as this barrow escaped that plundering of local barrows for funerary urns and maybe ornamentation that went with it. If you look in the middle of the barrow here, you'll see a large depression, and I don't think that's a coincidental bit of gravel digging. It looks as if this barrow was robbed maybe as much as 200 years ago. But the monuments remain, and they remain a visible testament of people with influence within their community being commemorated within the landscape on conspicuous ridges. This barrow here sits on a spur of chalkland that commands a great view across the Weald to the north, but also right down the London Road Valley towards Brighton and the sea. The view it has is also the view that it could be seen from, and you have to think of this monument when it was freshly built, higher than it is now, made out of white chalk against the green background of the landscape. They're a visible reminder of the presence of powerful individuals specifically, but also generally the ancestors of the community buried in the landscapes around. By the Middle Bronze Age, we're starting to see a step up in the degree to which the landscape is being divided into fields and field systems. And part of this division of the landscape involves the digging of very pronounced ditches, sometimes along contours, but quite often over ridges and spurs. And these features are called cross-ridge dikes. Here, just to the east of the round barrow, we find one of these cross-ridge dikes, a really pronounced feature in the landscape, even after maybe as much as 4,000 years. But of course, when this feature was dug, it would have been a very deep, almost V-shaped ditch in the landscape cut into the chalk, perhaps with a flanking bank on the upslope side. What were they for? Well, it may have been about dividing ownership up, and certainly the very fact that you've got these visible features in the landscape would have been very visible signatures that people are working and making a claim to the landscape. But also, it's thought that it may have controlled the way cattle, and we think at this time cattle would have been almost like a huge portable wealth, with very large herds being grazed on the downlands and maybe the Weald to the north. It's so visible, isn't it? We're now very close to the summit of Wolstonbury Hill itself, and we're on the southern flank of Wolstonbury Hill, and behind me over there you can see off in the distance the earlier Bronze Age round barrow, and then behind it, just on the ridge, you can see the Middle Bronze Age cross dyke. We have very little to understand what role Wolstonbury Hill played in Bronze Age communities. And surmounting this hill is a very visible ditch and bank forming a circular enclosure. I'm standing here on the bank itself, and here, running and circling the hill, is the ditch. Now the ditch would have originally been much deeper than we see now. It's had the best part of 3,000 years to weather and silt up. So we have to imagine this ditch when it was freshly cut into the chalk, and the bank here on the outside, a bank of white chalk. And you imagine how distinctive that feature would have been in the landscape. So why go to that incredible effort to enclose an entire high hill? Well, this comes at the end of the story of the Bronze Age landscape. Away to the southeast, we've already seen the early Bronze Age round barrow and the first indications of intensification of the landscape in agriculture with the Middle Bronze Age cross dyke. But here we've got an enclosure that we think dates to the late Bronze Age and is one of the earliest of a class of monument which goes on to dominate the British landscape for the next 1,000 years, hill forts. Hill forts weren't just defensive structures. They have a variety of uses through the 1,000 years they were being constructed. In some cases, they were enclosed settlements, sometimes on the scale of small towns. Here, on the highest, most exposed spot of the downs around here, you cannot imagine year-round settlement. So maybe this had a more specific purpose. One of the clues may be the distinctive fact that here the ditch lies on the inside of the bank. In purely defensive hill forts, it makes far more sense to cut the ditch on the outside, giving attacking enemies a big disadvantage. But here we have a rare example where the ditch is on the inside. And one explanation for this would be to keep something inside. And that something could well have been cattle. But it's no simple circular field. This is a statement of power. This is a statement of wealth. To think of the amount of labour to construct a monument of this scale in such a high point in the landscape, such a visible point in the landscape, means something. It's showing particular members of the community, particular families within the landscape are controlling and commanding not just territory, but also people. And in that way, Wolstonbury is as much a demonstration of Bronze Age elite power and wealth as the personal adornments. Here we have a landscape demonstration of landscape scale power.
There is another circular prehistoric monument, a mysterious earthwork, built on the same swathe of chalk in the south of England, with ditch and bank, which is rather better known than Wolstonbury Hill. Of course, Stonehenge also has some stones standing inside the circle. And on Salisbury Plain, where the iconic stones stand at the western edge of the underlying chalk formation, it's a great deal flatter than the South Downs, but it is the same swathe of prehistoric ground. Were the scheduled monuments on Chantry Farm and Wolstonbury Hill created in the same era as Stonehenge? Yes, they are likely contemporaries. For over 1,000 years, huge effort was expended to create these iconic monuments at highly visible points in the landscape. In making this documentary, we stumbled across the nuances of a henge versus a hill fort, and a variety of differing opinions as to their designations and uses. Perhaps the reason Stonehenge is so loved is that it stands in testimony to the fact that thousands of years ago, beyond animal herding, defensive forts, and burial, people in the south of England made tremendous effort to work with the more subtle forces which surround us. If every prehistoric earthwork hints at that, they too stand the test of time, not just in their presence, but as a representation of wisdom.